in 1887, on the outskirts of Providence, Rhode Island. The Whitlock Asylum opened its iron gates for the first time. Officially named the Whitlock Institute for the Care of the Feeble-Minded, it was heralded in newspapers as a beacon of progress and compassion, a place where modern medicine and genteel philanthropy would ease the suffering of society's most vulnerable. Behind the speeches and ribbon cuttings stood the Whitlock family, an old New England dynasty whose wealth had flowed from railroads, shipping, and land speculation. To the public, they were benefactors, men and women of refinement who offered their fortune for the noble purpose of uplifting the sick and forgotten. Yet within the stately red brick walls of their institution, beneath the vaulted ceilings and gaslit corridors, lay the first clues to America's forgotten bloodline, a lineage tainted by secrecy, obsession, and the willingness to sacrifice others for its survival. The asylum itself was an architectural marvel, modeled after European sanatoriums with high-arched windows, sprawling wings, and manicured grounds designed to soothe the mind. But the grandeur was deceptive. Almost from the beginning, families who entrusted their sons, daughters, and kin to the Whitlocks reported silence where letters should have come, evasions where answers should have been given. Patients admitted for melancholy or epilepsy disappeared from correspondence, their names erased from visitor logs as though they had never existed. To those outside, the asylum remained a monument of civic pride. To those within, it became a labyrinth of whispers, locked doors, and nights broken by the echo of cries carried down stone corridors. The Whitlocks themselves were no ordinary patrons of medicine. Their lineage stretched back to colonial days, when Elias Whitlock, the family patriarch, amassed land during King Philip's War and built an empire from the spoils. By the 19th century, the family's fortune rivaled that of the Vanderbilts or the Astors, though the Whitlocks cultivated a quieter reputation. They built libraries, funded churches, and spoke the language of duty and morality. Yet among servants and close acquaintances, darker stories circulated, whispered accounts of gatherings in shuttered parlors, of infants born in secrecy, and of journals filled with strange symbols that looked more like scripture for an unknown religion than medical notes. The asylum was their stage. Dr. Erasmus Whitlock, eldest son of the dynasty, styled himself a physician, though his credentials were always in question. He lectured on hereditary taint, claiming that madness, poverty, and criminality ran in the blood like a contagion. To purify a bloodline, he once declared to a gathering of physicians in Boston, is to redeem the future of a nation. These words, printed in the Providence Journal, sounded progressive to some, but to those who later unearthed his private papers, they revealed something far more sinister, an obsession with isolating pure Whitlock stock from the dilution of ordinary humanity. From the asylum's first year, the numbers failed to match. Records from 1888 show 243 patients admitted, but only 176 accounted for in discharge papers. Where had the others gone? The official explanation, natural death, transfer to other institutions, might have sufficed had the burial grounds not told a different story. Local gravediggers recalled nighttime wagons delivering bodies with no coffins, only shrouds lowered into unmarked earth. And then there were the rumors of tunnels, stone passages running beneath the asylum into the woods, where no patient ever returned. To step inside the asylum was to feel a curious duality. Visitors were guided through bright day rooms where patients played piano or worked at weaving looms, smiling weakly for the benefit of benefactors. But former attendants would later describe how, beyond the show wards, there were locked wings where daylight never reached. Here, patients were strapped to iron bedsteads, subjected to electrical treatments that left them convulsing or bled until their skin turned ashen. The Whitlocks justified it as science. Survivors whispered of rituals, strange chanting in the dead of night. Patients led in circles around copper devices that sparked with blue light, and the family themselves watching from balconies as though attending a theater. The family bloodline wove through every aspect of the asylum's operations. Nieces and nephews were placed in administrative posts. Cousins oversaw the finances. In time, whispers grew that some of the patients themselves carried Whitlock blood, illegitimate offspring, inconvenient heirs, or children born of arrangements too scandalous to be acknowledged publicly. What better place to hide them than within the walls of their own institution? A census in 1895 reveals surnames erased, replaced with initials. The name Whitlock appears more than once, though never in official death records. Outside, the people of Providence continued to admire the Whitlocks' charity. But the town also whispered. Farmers swore they heard singing from the woods near the asylum at midnight, voices rising in unison with no words they could understand. Hunters reported finding animal carcasses arranged in patterns, their blood marking the soil. A parish priest, Father Alcott, claimed that several parishioners confessed visions of pale figures walking the asylum grounds after curfew, their mouths moving in silent prayer. By the turn of the century, the first scandals broke. A nurse named Helen Carter fled the asylum and testified before a local magistrate that she had seen children led into underground chambers, never to emerge. Her statement was dismissed as hysteria. She was committed to an institution herself within months. But her words lived on in clippings preserved in dusty courthouse files. The Whitlocks seek not to cure the sick, but to harvest them. The asylum's reputation began to fray, yet the family's influence shielded them from inquiry. Judges dined at Whitlock estates. Newspapers that dared to question the asylum's operations found their editors removed. But behind the curtain of wealth and power, a secret truth was taking root, that the Whitlocks were less healers than harvesters, using their institution as a farm for experiments meant to extend their dynasty and bind their bloodline beyond the reach of time. The year 1901 marked a turning point. That winter, a blizzard struck Providence, burying the asylum in snowdrifts so deep that local authorities were forced to dig a path to the gates. When rescuers entered, they reported entire wards, silent beds, still occupied by corpses. Attendants vanished, and the Whitlocks nowhere to be found. Survivors spoke of the family retreating into the tunnels, carrying with them their journals and their chosen kin. When the snow melted, the asylum reopened as if nothing had happened, its ledgers rewritten, its staff replaced. But among townsfolk, the phrase took hold. Beneath the Whitlock Asylum lies America's forgotten bloodline. It is here, in these first shadows of grandeur and secrecy, that the story begins, a story not of medicine, but of ritual, not of charity, but of a dynasty willing to sacrifice its patience, its heirs, and its humanity to preserve a name. The question that haunted Providence then, and still lingers in the archives now, is chilling in its simplicity. What did the Whitlocks bury beneath their asylum, and what part of that bloodline still walks among us? The Whitlock bloodline was not merely a family tree, it was a fortress. By the late 19th century, their influence stretched far beyond the walls of their asylum, woven into the political and economic arteries of Rhode Island itself. Bankers relied on their loans, judges accepted their patronage, and clergy praised their donations. To outsiders, the Whitlocks seemed a model of patrician responsibility, a dynasty committed to uplifting the poor and sick. But within their private estate, the family operated by a different creed. Blood was currency, and the purity of that blood had to be guarded at all costs. The earliest records trace the Whitlocks back to Elias Whitlock, a land baron who settled in Providence during the late 1600s. His fortune began in timber and grew through shipping routes that ferried goods from the West Indies. Family legend held that Elias was more than a shrewd businessman, that he trafficked in favors from the old world, alliances forged in secret societies that operated on both sides of the Atlantic. By the 1700s, the Whitlocks were counted among the first families of New England, their manor houses dotting the landscape from Providence to Newport. They funded schools and almshouses, but whispers circulated even then. Elias's children were buried apart from others, their headstones marked with symbols no one could decipher. Generations later, when Erasmus Whitlock took up medicine in the 1870s, he presented himself as the natural heir to this lineage of refinement and civic duty. But his writings tell another story. In his journals recovered decades later in a courthouse basement, he raged against dilution, against the intermarriage of Whitlocks with outsiders, and against the weakness he claimed was spreading through American families. He spoke of restoring the bloodline through selection and sacrifice, a phrase repeated across multiple volumes. The Asylum became the instrument of this philosophy. Built with funds from the Whitlock fortune and disguised as a public charity, it offered Erasmus the perfect laboratory. Here, he could admit those whose bloodlines were deemed corrupted, the poor, the mentally ill, the criminal, and study them under the guise of medical treatment. But within its walls, rumors claimed he also admitted kin, illegitimate Whitlock children, cousins born of scandal, relatives whose behavior threatened to taint the family's reputation. These unfortunates, erased from genealogical records, were absorbed into the Asylum, their names hidden under initials or pseudonyms. What emerged was a pattern that investigators would later call the doctrine of inheritance. Patients with no documented ties to the Whitlocks often vanished quickly, dying in experiments or disappearing into the grounds. But those with even a trace of Whitlock blood were kept alive, studied, and sometimes allowed to breed with others in carefully arranged pairings. The Asylum became less a hospital than a breeding ground, its ward serving as both prison and nursery. Testimony from former attendants in the early 1900s described an unsettling obsession with lineage charts. Erasmus and his siblings were said to spend nights in the Asylum library, surrounded by family Bibles and medical texts, mapping out which patients carried Whitlock stock. Birth records were altered, and in some cases, destroyed. Newborns were whisked away from mothers under the justification of incapacity, placed in orphanages that the Whitlocks themselves controlled. Many were later readmitted to the Asylum as adolescents, completing a cycle of secrecy. To the wider world, none of this was visible. Visitors saw airy day rooms, orderly staff, and neat ledgers. Inspectors were shown rows of patients engaged in harmless crafts, smiling faintly for the benefit of their guests. But those same inspectors often spent their evenings in the Whitlocks' drawing rooms, sipping brandy and enjoying the hospitality of the very family they were meant to scrutinize. What they never saw were the locked basements, the copper instruments wired to crude batteries, or the soundproofed wards where patients screamed into silence. By the turn of the century, the family's public reputation was near unassailable. They funded scholarships at Brown University, endowed a chapel in Providence, and hosted winter balls attended by governors and senators. Yet among servants and townspeople, the stories darkened. It was said that infants were sometimes delivered directly to the Asylum rather than to homes. It was said that Erasmus conducted marriages between patients, officiated not by clergy, but by physicians, the unions recorded only in secret ledgers. And it was said that the Whitlocks believed their bloodline was not simply noble, but chosen, that through ritual and experiment, they could transcend the limits of ordinary mortality. These beliefs seeped into the asylum's daily life. Patients with faint ties to the family often received gentler treatment, sometimes allowed to walk the grounds or sit with books in the library. Those without such ties were relegated to the lower wards, where treatments left them skeletal, bruised, or dead. In letters that survived from nurses dismissed in scandal, descriptions appear of children with unmistakably Whitlock features kept in isolation, taught not to speak of their names, raised as if in preparation for some hidden role. The town, too, began to notice. In the 1890s, Providence saw a spate of disappearances, orphans, wayward women, immigrants. Many were last seen near the asylum's gates. Police inquiries were swiftly redirected by magistrates with Whitlock connections. Churches received donations that silenced dissent. Newspapers printed flattering profiles of Erasmus, portraying him as a visionary dedicated to improving the American stock. The Bloodline's shadow lengthened, unbroken by scrutiny. It was only decades later, when the asylum's records were unsealed, that historians pieced together the scale of the deception. Dozens of patient files bore the same last name, though crossed out or altered. Burial ledgers listed unknown beside ages that matched Whitlock bastards whispered about in town. Even more chilling were the genealogical charts discovered in Erasmus's handwriting, webs of names branching from the Whitlock trunk, marked with notes like suitable, tainted, or preserve. The asylum, beneath its facade of mercy, had become a vault for a family's darkest ambition, to engineer their own bloodline, untouched by scandal, purified by cruelty, and hidden from the judgment of the outside world. And if the records are to be believed, their methods did not end with breeding or segregation. The next stage would be far worse rituals that blurred the line between science and sacrifice, carried out not in the wards above, but in the tunnels beneath. For the Whitlocks, family was everything. To protect it, they were willing to erase patients, falsify deaths, and bury children in nameless graves. And yet, as later investigators would discover, the obsession with purity carried its own corruption. For beneath the asylum's manicured grounds, the Whitlocks were not preserving their bloodline. They were poisoning it, binding it to a legacy of cruelty that would haunt their name for generations to come. By the dawn of the new century, the Whitlock Asylum had already earned a quiet reputation among those who dared to question its spotless public image. On paper, the institution was thriving. Annual reports boasted of innovative treatments, reduced mortality, and steady progress in the management of the feeble-minded. Brochures sent to wealthy donors spoke of airy wards, devoted nurses, and patients who learned trades under kindly supervision. But for every report that painted a picture of benevolence, there were whispers, stories carried by families who never saw their loved ones again, by dismissed attendants who could no longer bear their conscience, and by townsfolk who swore the asylum grounds were cursed. The most troubling of these whispers concerned the missing. By 1903, discrepancies between admission and discharge records had grown impossible to ignore. State inspectors noted the irregularities but accepted the Whitlock's explanations. Clerical errors, patients transferred to other institutions, natural deaths. Yet no transfer paperwork ever surfaced, and burial plots in the asylum cemetery were far too few to account for the numbers. Entire wings seemed to absorb patients who were never mentioned again. Relatives who attempted to visit often encountered resistance. They were told their loved ones were not fit for company or undergoing an advanced form of treatment. In some cases, families arrived only to be told the patient had died days earlier, with the body already buried in the asylum grounds. No funeral, no chance to see them one final time. The grieving were shown neat rows of modest stones, most bearing no names, only initials or numbers. Local gravediggers later recalled nighttime burials, shrouded figures lowered into earth without ceremony, their graves filled quickly before dawn. One of the earliest voices of dissent came from Reverend Josiah Bell, a minister whose parish included several families with kin at Whitlock. In sermons delivered between 1899 and 1901, Bell hinted at unhallowed practices within the asylum. Beware the institution that cloaks cruelty with charity, he warned, though he never named the Whitlocks directly. By spring of 1901, Reverend Bell himself had vanished. His disappearance was reported in the Providence Gazette, but no trace of him was found. Among townspeople, it was whispered that Bell had gone to the asylum one evening to demand answers, and that he never returned. The staff, too, began to unravel under the strain of secrets. Nurses who left the institution carried chilling testimonies. One woman, dismissed after less than a year, later told investigators that she had seen children led away in the dead of night, taken down staircases that did not appear on the asylum's architectural plans. Another described the basement wards as a charnel house, where patients were strapped into copper devices that sparked with blue light, while Whitlock men chanted prayers in Latin. Such claims were dismissed as hysteria at the time, but later excavations beneath the asylum would uncover remnants of wiring, restraints, and burnt copper plates etched with symbols no one could decipher. For those who lived nearby, the asylum was a presence both physical and spiritual. Farmers claimed to hear faint chanting from the woods at night, carried on the wind like a dirge. Hunters reported finding circles of animal carcasses arranged with uncanny precision, their blood staining the soil in patterns. Children dared each other to approach the iron gates and swore they saw pale faces at the windows, watching silently. Even seasoned policemen avoided the grounds after dark, preferring to patrol the main roads rather than cut too near the asylum walls. Perhaps most unsettling were the accounts of the asylum cemetery. The small graveyard was intended as a place of peace, its wrought iron fence enclosing neat rows of headstones. But townsfolk who ventured close told of strange disturbances, earth that seemed freshly turned though no burials had been announced, stones that bore different initials from one week to the next, and shadows that lingered long after sunset. A schoolteacher who took her pupils on a Sunday walked past the grounds later wrote in her diary that several children screamed when they saw figures rising from the soil, only to vanish like smoke when approached. Her account was never published, but the diary survives in a local archive, another thread in the tapestry of unease. The Whitlocks, of course, denied everything. When questioned, they produced carefully prepared documents, offered generous donations to investigators, and invoked their long history of civic service. Erasmus Whitlock, in particular, relished the role of embattled visionary. To journalists, he declared that his work was misunderstood, that progress requires sacrifice, and the ignorant always resist the light of science. Yet even his defenders could not explain why so many names in the admission books ended in silence, or why so many families left the asylum grounds without answers, only grief. By 1905, rumors had hardened into something darker, the belief that the Whitlocks were not merely negligent, but deliberate in their cruelty, that the missing patients were not lost to incompetence or accident, but taken for a purpose known only to the family. Some whispered that the Whitlocks believed their bloodline required offerings, that each vanished patient fed a hunger older than the asylum itself. Others claimed the missing were incorporated into twisted experiments, their bodies used to test methods of extending life or purifying blood. Whatever the truth, the pattern was undeniable. For every patient discharged, another was erased. For every burial witnessed, 2 or 3 names vanished without trace. And in the silence of those missing years, the asylum stood unshaken, its windows glowing softly at night, its halls echoing with footsteps that no outsider was allowed to follow. It was here, in the long shadow of the missing, that the legend of the Whitlock bloodline began to take root, not just as a family obsessed with its own purity, but as keepers of something that demanded more than secrecy, something that demanded lives. And as the years passed, Providence would learn that those whispers were not merely superstition, but the first cracks in a truth far more terrible than anyone had dared to imagine. By the time the first decade of the 20th century waned, the asylum's walls had begun to speak not in words, but in the restless murmurs of those confined within. Former attendants, when questioned years later, described nights broken by screams so sharp they cut through brick and iron. Patients begged for deliverance from the family, a phrase they uttered with terror, as though the Whitlocks themselves moved like specters through the wards. It was in these years that the most enduring stories of the asylum's hauntings took shape, accounts not from ghost seekers, but from exhausted nurses, orderlies, and even physicians who fled their posts, unable to stomach what they had seen. One such testimony came from a nurse named Clara Dempsey, preserved in a deposition she gave during a brief state inquiry in 1910. Clara described the locked East Wing, a section of the asylum officially designated for incurables. "We were told," she said, "that these patients could not abide the company of others, that they harmed themselves if left unattended. Yet when I was called to tend them, I found men and women strapped to iron cots, their bodies marked with burns and strange lesions. At night, when the gaslights dimmed, they chanted not hymns, not ravings, but the same words, in the same order, as though rehearsed. And always, above them, watching from the balcony, stood members of the Whitlock family, whispering to each other in a tongue I could not understand." Her account might have been dismissed as exaggeration had it not been echoed by others. Orderlies spoke of patients who refused food unless it was blessed by the Whitlocks themselves, who wept and clawed at the doors whenever the family left the grounds. It was as if, one attendant remarked, the patients believed the Whitlocks were priests of some darker order, the only ones who could protect them from what lurked in the halls at night. Israelifli ves and zan. But the most chilling stories came from the patients themselves. Surviving fragments of medical logs reveal repeated entries where inmates described a procession moving through the wards after midnight. Figures in dark robes carrying lanterns, stopping at each bed to touch the patient's forehead. Some described the touch as burning, others as freezing, but all agreed it left them unable to sleep until dawn. More than one patient scrawled drawings on scraps of paper circles with interlocking symbols, crude renderings of copper crowns, and a tall figure with hollow eyes. These scraps were confiscated, marked as delusional art, and destroyed, where possible. A handful, hidden in hymnals and clothing seams, survived to confirm that these visions were not isolated, but widespread. The Whitlocks themselves gave no public explanation. To visitors, they insisted the asylum was a place of serenity. They guided inspectors through manicured wards, where select patients smiled and read from Bibles, where gas lamps glowed steadily, and orderlies moved with calm efficiency. Yet behind those showrooms lay the wards Clara and others described, places where chanting continued long into the night, where patients bore marks of experiments that no inspector was permitted to witness. Rumors filtered into town of children within the asylum, speaking languages they had never learned, of patients suddenly recalling memories that were not their own. One farmer told a reporter in hushed tones that he encountered a boy wandering near the asylum fence who called him father. Though the farmer had no children, when authorities investigated, the boy had vanished, and the Whitlocks denied that any patient had been outside. Even among staff loyal to the family, there was unease. A physician named Dr. Hollis, whose diary was discovered decades later, wrote of his growing horror. "I no longer trust what I see. Patients rise from their beds after injections that should still their bodies for hours. I hear voices in the walls repeating my own words back to me. The Whitlocks insist the treatments are scientific, but I fear they are harvesting more than the body. I fear they are harvesting the soul." He vanished in 1911, leaving only his diary behind. The phrase, "the family walking the halls," became a refrain. Patients used it as explanation for sudden fits, for nights of terror when they clawed their own faces or tried to tear free from restraints. Nurses whispered it to one another when doors unlocked themselves or when meals left in locked rooms were found half-eaten by unseen mouths. Even inspectors, bribed and complicit, confessed unease. One, writing anonymously to a colleague, admitted, "I will not stay overnight within those walls. Something moves there that is not bound by locks nor chains." The Whitlocks smile and call it progress. I call it unholy. The asylum's reputation in Providence began to shift. Though the wealthy continued to donate, common folk avoided the grounds. Church sermons hinted at sins cloaked in science. Parents warned children never to stray near the iron gates after dark. Still, the Whitlocks remained untouchable, their wealth and influence protecting them from consequence. The more rumors spread, the more the family withdrew into the asylum, holding gatherings that lasted until dawn, their windows glowing with a strange, bluish light that townspeople swore was not fire nor gas, but something otherworldly. By 1912, when the first formal complaints were lodged with state authorities, dozens of families had already given up hope of seeing their loved ones again. Their petitions were met with silence, their letters unanswered. A committee was formed to investigate, but its members, all men of wealth, returned with glowing reports and recommendations for increased funding. The asylum continued as before, its secrets intact, yet the stories did not die. They lingered in diaries, in whispered testimonies, in the fading memories of attendants who dared to speak after fleeing. They painted a picture not of medicine but of ritual, of a family who believed themselves stewards of a bloodline that must be preserved at any cost. And beneath it all ran the same refrain, repeated in the wards, in the woods, in the nightmares of Providence. The family walked the halls, and wherever they walked, silence followed. This chapter of whispers and testimonies became the foundation for all that followed. For it was here, in the voices of the forgotten, that the truth began to crack through the Whitlocks' facade. And though few believed it then, the words of the broken and the missing carried a weight that time would only confirm. That the asylum was no sanctuary but a theater of horrors, staged for the benefit of a dynasty whose hunger was never satisfied. The Whitlock Asylum reached its height of notoriety in the years leading up to 1912, when whispers about its inner workings began spilling from the wards and into the public sphere. But if the testimonies of nurses and attendants hinted at cruelty, the writings of Dr. Erasmus Whitlock himself revealed the true engine driving the institution, a philosophy he called the Bloodline doctrine. In his journals hidden for decades in a sealed trunk and later recovered in a courthouse archive, Erasmus described his obsession with heredity, ritual, and the unshakable belief that his family's lineage was both divine and endangered. The doctrine was deceptively simple on its surface. Erasmus argued that all weakness, madness, poverty, criminality stemmed not from circumstance but from corrupted blood. "The veins are conduits of destiny," he wrote in 1898, "and if one would restore a nation, one must restore its blood." This idea was not unique in an age fascinated by eugenics. But Erasmus's application carried a far darker edge. Where others wrote of selective breeding and social engineering, he envisioned a fusion of medicine and ritual sacrifice. The asylum became his laboratory, the patients his subjects, and the family fortune, the mask that shielded him from scrutiny. The first sign of this doctrine at work appeared in the asylum's admission records. Inspectors noted patients categorized not merely by illness, but by ancestry. Names were marked with symbols in the margins, circles, crosses, stars, notations. No one outside the family could decipher. Years later, scholars would determine these marks corresponded to bloodlines. Those with even a trace of Whitlock heritage were spared the harshest treatments, while those deemed tainted were selected for more radical experiments. We must preserve our kind from within and purge the rest from without, Erasmus wrote, a chilling declaration of intent. What made the doctrine especially terrifying was its blending of science and superstition. Erasmus did not reject medicine. On the contrary, he embraced phrenology, early neurology, and the crude beginnings of electrotherapy. But he overlaid these practices with rites borrowed from obscure texts. His journals reference the Corpus Maleficarum, a compendium of occult philosophy rumored to have circulated in Boston's secret societies, and speak of rituals conducted on equinoxes and solstices. Copper crowns wired to crude batteries were placed on patients' heads, not only for stimulation of the mind, but to open the vessel of blood to the whisper of eternity. Testimony from staff corroborated these practices. One attendant, Edward Mallory, later confessed that he assisted in demonstrations where patients were seated in circles, each connected by wires to a central chair occupied by Erasmus himself. Mallory claimed Erasmus chanted in Latin, his voice rising as sparks leapt from copper plates and patients convulsed in unison. When the demonstration ended, some were left catatonic, others violent, and a few dead. Yet Erasmus recorded these outcomes clinically, noting which bloodlines resisted and which yielded. Even more disturbing was the role of children in these rituals. Adoption records reveal that orphans, often those rumored to be Whitlock bastards, were brought into the asylum under false names. Once inside, they vanished from all official accounts. A surviving letter from a nurse to her sister described a child of no more than 8, pale as milk, placed in the central chair while the family gathered round as though at church. The nurse was dismissed within the month. Her letter is one of the few surviving traces of what she witnessed. Outside the asylum, the doctrine seeped into the town of Providence like a slow poison. The Whitlocks hosted lectures in which Erasmus spoke of hereditary purity and the dangers of intermarriage. Newspapers, funded by the family's donations, praised his words as forward-thinking, even visionary. Yet within working-class neighborhoods, families whispered of missing sons and daughters, of asylum wagons that arrived at night and left with more passengers than were recorded in the morning logs. The community learned not to ask too many questions. For the Whitlocks' reach extended into the courts, the churches, even the police. Still, not all could be silenced. In 1909, a young clerk named Samuel Pritchard stumbled upon a ledger in the asylum archives that listed patient names beside cryptic notes: offered, preserved, returned. Horrified, he copied several entries and attempted to bring them to the local press. Days later, he was found drowned in the Providence River. His death ruled a suicide. The ledger vanished, but rumors of its contents survived in hushed conversations. The doctrine's most chilling passage appears in Erasmus's final journal, dated October 1911. To graft memory and will onto the unbroken line of Whitlock stock is to cheat the grave itself. The patients offer what is weak. The family inherits what is strong. In this exchange, there is immortality. These words have haunted historians ever since. They suggest the Whitlocks were not merely preserving their family name, but attempting to bind themselves to a legacy beyond death, using the asylum as both temple and laboratory. Patients were not healed but harvested, their suffering transmuted into a grotesque offering for the Bloodline's endurance. By the time whispers of the Bloodline doctrine began to leak beyond Providence, the damage was already done. Generations of patients had vanished, their bodies buried in unmarked graves or lost in the tunnels beneath the asylum. Families who pressed too hard for answers were silenced, sometimes permanently, and the Whitlocks, secure in their wealth, continued to present themselves as patrons of progress. But beneath the facade, a darker truth was being written in blood and secrecy. The doctrine had become more than Erasmus's obsession. It had become the guiding principle of an entire dynasty. And as the 20th century pressed forward, that principle would not only sustain the Whitlocks, but drag them ever deeper into a legacy of corruption and horror that Providence would struggle to forget. The asylum's walls still stand today, crumbling and vine-choked, but the doctrine echoes in every report, every deposition, every whispered memory of those who survived. For in the Whitlock creed, mercy was weakness, suffering was currency, and blood was destiny. And it was this doctrine, sealed beneath the asylum's iron gates, that transformed a house of healing into America's most sinister vault of forgotten lives. The year 1912 was supposed to bring reckoning to the Whitlocks. For months, rumors of cruelty and disappearance had crept beyond Providence, whispered not only in taverns and churches, but in the State House itself. Families demanded answers, clergy pressed for oversight, and newspapers, though cautious of the Whitlocks' reach, hinted at grave irregularities within the asylum's walls. At last, a formal inquiry was convened. For the first time, the dynasty would be called to account. Yet what unfolded in that courtroom did not reveal justice. Instead, it revealed the strange, theatrical way in which power, secrecy, and bloodline intertwined, shielding the family even as their sins were dragged into daylight. The trial of 1912 was less a criminal proceeding than a spectacle. The Whitlocks, with their fortune and influence, ensured that the panel of judges was stocked with allies, men who had dined at their estates and benefited from their donations. Yet the sheer volume of testimony made it impossible to silence the scandal completely. One by one, attendants, nurses, and even patients were brought forth to speak of what they had seen in the asylum's hidden wings. The first witness, a young orderly named Joseph Crane, described being instructed to carry bodies through the asylum's underground tunnels, delivering them to what he called the pit, a chamber walled with stone beneath the east wing. There, he said, men in Whitlock livery performed rites over the corpses before consigning them to fire. When pressed by the judges, Crane faltered, his voice trembling. He insisted he had not been coerced to testify, but his eyes flicked often to the Whitlock gallery, where Erasmus himself sat erect, his pale eyes fixed on the boy with an intensity that suggested menace. Another nurse, Margaret O'Rourke, told the court of children kept in isolation. They bore the family's features, she said, her hands twisting her handkerchief until it tore. Light hair, the same gray eyes. They were never listed as patients, but I saw them in the wards. I was told to feed them and never speak their names aloud. Her statement drew a murmur from the gallery, silenced only when the presiding judge banged his gavel. Moments later, the record shows, her testimony was struck for irrelevance, and she was escorted out under guard. Perhaps the most damning evidence came from patient accounts themselves, read aloud from confiscated diaries. One passage described nightly visits from Erasmus Whitlock, who touched the patient's forehead with a copper crown connected to wires that sparked faintly blue. He told me I was chosen. The patient wrote that my memory would live forever, though not within me. I am emptied nightly, yet still I live. Such words, preserved in the trial documents, cast the asylum less as a place of healing than as a furnace in which identity itself was consumed. Yet for every revelation, the Whitlocks offered a rebuttal. Their attorneys argued that disgruntled staff fabricated stories out of bitterness. They dismissed the diaries as delusions of the mentally unsound. They presented ledgers, carefully prepared, showing patient transfers and discharges that neatly explained the missing. And always, they reminded the judges of the Whitlocks' generosity, the churches they had built, the scholarships they had funded, the civic improvements their money had purchased. Would such benefactors, one lawyer asked rhetorically, stoop to barbarity? Newspapers reported the proceedings with a mixture of awe and unease. Headlines spoke of startling allegations and unfounded slanders, often within the same edition. Editorials praised the family's restraint under attack. Photographs captured Erasmus outside the courthouse, his posture dignified, his expression calm, as though he were attending a social function rather than a tribunal that might unmake his legacy. The verdict, when it came, was inevitable. The panel declared that, while some irregularities may have occurred in record-keeping, there was no evidence of intentional harm. The asylum was cleared to continue operations, with only a recommendation for greater transparency in its accounting. Families who had pressed for answers wept openly in the courtroom, their cries drowned out by the applause of Whitlock supporters. But if the trial failed to convict, it succeeded in peeling back a corner of the facade. Reporters who had once written glowing profiles of the Whitlocks now described them in more cautious terms. Whispers multiplied in Providence that the family had escaped justice through money and manipulation. And, most chilling of all, new testimonies began to circulate beyond the courtroom's walls, accounts too strange to fit neatly into legal records, but too consistent to ignore. One dismissed attendant claimed that on the very night the trial ended, she saw torches moving in the asylum's graveyard. The Whitlock men gathered around an open grave. Another swore that in the weeks following, she found copper headbands buried beneath the floorboards of the east wing. Their wires charred as though scorched from within. Townsfolk reported hearing the asylum bell toll 13 times at midnight, a sound that chilled them even as officials insisted it was a mechanical fault. The trial did not end the story, it deepened it. For it proved that the Whitlocks were untouchable in life, their sins protected by wealth and lineage. What it could not hide was the persistence of the stories, the way witnesses repeated their tales despite ridicule, the way townspeople shunned the asylum even as it grew. And in those stories, the asylum shifted from a contested institution into a legend, a place where the law could not reach, where lives vanished into tunnels, where a family's obsession with blood eclipsed mercy itself. The inquiry of 1912 may have absolved the Whitlocks on paper, but it branded them in memory. From that moment forward, the asylum was no longer merely a hospital. It was a theater of whispers, its name spoken with dread in Providence's taverns and churches. The trial's transcripts, bound and stored in dusty archives, would one day be read not as legal history but as the prologue to something far more terrible. The revelation that beneath the Whitlock Asylum lay America's forgotten bloodline, still pulsing, still hungry, still hidden in plain sight. After the trial of 1912, the Whitlocks emerged outwardly unscathed, their wealth and influence shielding them from consequence. Yet within the asylum walls, something shifted. The family became more reclusive, their presence in public life dwindling as they poured their energies into the subterranean chambers beneath the institution. Here, in the labyrinth of tunnels that laced the foundation, medicine gave way entirely to ritual. Former attendants, speaking years later, recalled the sense of dread that fell over the building once the Whitlocks retreated below. The halls grew quieter, one said, but it was the quiet of a tomb. The tunnels had long been a source of speculation. Built during the asylum's earliest days, they were intended to transport supplies and coal unseen by visitors. Yet records suggest the tunnels were expanded over time, branching deep into the earth until they formed a network more suited to a crypt than a hospital. Stone walls bore carvings that no mason claimed responsibility for, interlocking circles, spiral patterns, and crude human figures etched with meticulous care. Torches burned at odd hours, casting shadows that seemed to move with unnatural rhythm. Patients spoke of being led below and never returning, their absence explained by forged transfers or sudden deaths that left no bodies for grieving families to claim. One nurse, whose diary survived in fragments, described being summoned underground late at night to assist with what she was told was an experimental treatment. She wrote of entering a circular chamber lined with chairs, each occupied by a patient fitted with a copper crown attached to wires that converged at a central throne. In that throne sat Erasmus Whitlock, chanting in a low voice while his relatives observed from alcoves carved into the walls. The patients shook, as if caught between waking and death, the nurse wrote. Blue light danced between the wires. When it ended, some were lifeless, others emptied of memory. Dr. Whitlock smiled as if satisfied. The final line in her diary reads simply, "I will not go below again. Better dismissal than damnation." She was gone from the asylum records a week later. The tunnels also housed what became known among staff as the nursery. Though no official map acknowledged its existence, survivors spoke of children raised in confinement, their births unrecorded, their names unknown. Some were the offspring of patients, others, according to persistent rumor, the illegitimate heirs of Whitlock men, hidden away to preserve the family's public image. These children were subjected to the same copper devices, their memories harvested and replaced until they answered only to the family. They were pale, silent things, one attendant recalled decades later, with eyes too old for their years. Stranger still were the reports of rituals that blurred the line between science and sacrament. A former guard testified in old age that he once witnessed the Whitlocks gathered around a body on a stone table, its chest cut open not for surgery, but for ceremony. They anointed the heart with their own blood, he said, then burned it while chanting. The air stank of iron and incense. One of them told me not to fear, it was only the price of purity. His testimony was dismissed as senile rambling, but it matched the fragments found in Erasmus's journals, where he wrote of binding the essence of the fallen into the blood of the chosen. For townspeople, the asylum's presence grew more sinister with each passing year. Hunters reported strange lights flickering from vents in the hillside at night, accompanied by a low hum like distant machinery. Children dared each other to place their ears against the asylum's outer walls, swearing they heard voices chanting far below. Farmers spoke of livestock found mutilated near the grounds, their blood drained without a trace of struggle. Priests warned parishioners against venturing too close, declaring the asylum a house where neither God's grace nor the law of man hold sway. Even the staff who remained loyal to the Whitlocks could not ignore the changes. They noticed the family growing paler, their appearances less frequent, their speech increasingly arcane. One doctor recorded in his notes that Erasmus's skin had taken on a waxen quality, as if he were preserved rather than alive. Another described a Whitlock daughter who spoke in a voice not her own, but a chorus of many, claiming to recall events centuries past. These accounts were locked away, dismissed as madness, but they hint at what the family may have believed, that through their rituals they were grafting the memories of the lost onto their own blood, binding themselves to the essence of every life taken below. By 1915, the asylum was less an institution than a fortress. Patients were admitted but rarely discharged. Records were kept with obsessive secrecy, sealed behind ledgers bound in leather and hidden in the family vault. The tunnels expanded still further, and workmen hired to excavate new chambers often disappeared before their wages could be collected. Those who returned spoke of shadows moving against the torchlight, of whispers that echoed in their minds long after they left. One laborer claimed he saw a procession of figures in robes, their faces obscured, carrying jars that glowed faintly with silver light. He fled Providence that very night, leaving behind his tools. What exactly lay at the heart of the underground complex remains uncertain. Some claim the Whitlocks constructed a crypt to house the preserved remains of their ancestors, feeding their doctrine with blood rites. Others believe the tunnels concealed vast libraries of journals and occult texts, proof of their attempts to merge science with the supernatural. A few whisper of a collector's throne, a device meant to draw memories and lifeblood into a single vessel, preserving the family at the expense of all others. Whatever the truth, the tunnels were the soul of the asylum, hidden from inspectors, shielded by wealth, and haunted by those who vanished within. In time, Providence would forget the details, but the stories remained. Children told of secret stairs that led to endless darkness, of cries that rose from the ground on windless nights. Even now, when the asylum lies in ruins, locals swear that if one presses an ear to the earth, they can still hear chanting carried through stone. For the Whitlocks, the tunnels beneath their asylum were not merely architecture. They were a sanctuary, a laboratory, and a tomb, a place where blood was bound to memory, and where the doctrine of inheritance was carved into the very bones of the earth. By the late 1910s, the rituals of the Whitlock family had become inseparable from the daily life of the asylum. What had begun as crude experiments with wires and copper crowns evolved into elaborate ceremonies that fused the trappings of medicine with the cadence of liturgy. The line between doctor and priest vanished. For the Whitlocks, science was no longer a tool of healing, but a language through which to invoke powers older than the nation itself. And for the patients, those unwilling congregants, the asylum became a chapel of suffering. Witnesses described the preparations in unsettling detail. Patients were often chosen without warning, plucked from their wards in the middle of the night, and led, barefoot and shivering, into the tunnels below. They were dressed in thin linen gowns, their hair shaved or bound, and their wrists marked with chalk symbols that no nurse could decipher. Some were made to drink bitter concoctions, said to purify the blood. Others were deprived of food and sleep for days beforehand, weakened into submission. The family called these procedures induction. Staff who objected were told this was necessary preparation for treatment, but they could not reconcile that word with the terror they saw in the patient's eyes. At the heart of these rituals was the copper crown, a device Erasmus Whitlock claimed could open the vessel of memory. Each crown was fitted with wires that led to a central mechanism, a throne-like chair wrought from iron and brass, its arms inlaid with dials and sigils. When activated, sparks leapt between the wires, illuminating the chamber with a pale blue glow. Patients writhed, their cries echoing against stone, while the Whitlocks chanted in unison. Erasmus's journals reveal the intent was not to heal but to harvest, drawing forth memories, vitality, perhaps even the soul itself, to be preserved within the family's bloodline. The rituals followed a precise order, blending superstition with clinical detachment. First came invocation, the family reciting fragments from Latin texts, prayers warped into incantations. Next came alignment, patients seated in circles, their copper crowns linked by wires, while a Whitlock occupied the central throne. Then came the surge, as current from hidden batteries coursed through the circuit, filling the chamber with the smell of burning metal and ozone. Finally came collection, jars of a silvery liquid, carefully sealed and labeled, said to contain the essence extracted during the rite. These jars, some staff swore, were stored in locked cabinets alongside genealogical ledgers, as though both were equally vital to the dynasty's survival. The aftermath was often grotesque. Some patients emerged blank-eyed, unable to recall their own names. Others retained fragments of foreign memories, visions of events centuries past, or knowledge of places they had never seen. A few convulsed until death stilled them. To Erasmus, these outcomes were evidence of progress. His journals record observations with chilling calm. Subject expired, but offered purity to the line. Transfer incomplete, further calibration required. He spoke of lives lost, not as tragedy, but as tolls paid to advance his doctrine. And yet, there were moments when even the most hardened attendants felt they had witnessed something inexplicable. One nurse, who later fled the asylum, claimed she saw a patient rise from the throne with a voice not her own, speaking words in a dialect no one understood. Another testified that Erasmus's eyes glowed faintly during a ritual, reflecting not torchlight but something internal. Skeptics dismissed these accounts as hysteria, but those who stood in the chambers swore they were true. Outside the asylum, strange signs multiplied. Townsfolk reported hearing chants on still nights, carried from the hills by no wind. Families swore the asylum bell tolled 13 times at midnight, a sound never acknowledged by staff. Farmers found livestock with incisions too precise to be the work of predators, their blood gone though no tracks marked the earth. And in Providence proper, whispers spread that the Whitlocks themselves were changing, that their skin grew pale as wax, their speech slower, their eyes glassy yet piercing. At social functions, they appeared aloof, speaking in riddles or lapsing into silence mid-conversation, as though listening to voices only they could hear. The rituals also seeped into daily practice above ground. Patients in ordinary wards were subjected to experiments that mimicked the ceremonies below, though in quieter forms. They were given drafts of tinctures that induced hallucinations, then instructed to describe their visions. They were pricked and bled, their blood mixed with Whitlock kin in small vials labeled as control samples. Some were forced to sit for hours before mirrors while attendants recited genealogies, as if words alone could rethread their lineage. These measures had no medical justification, but they reinforced the family's belief that the asylum was less a hospital than a temple, and every patient a sacrifice waiting to be claimed. By 1918, the rituals had become more brazen. World War I offered the perfect cover. Soldiers returned home broken in body and mind, and many were admitted to the asylum as wards of the state. Their disappearances drew little notice in the chaos of the post-war years. Erasmus wrote with satisfaction of fresh vessels delivered by war itself, and rituals increased in frequency. Survivors spoke of chambers filled with the sound of dozens chanting voices, the blue sparks bright enough to silhouette shadows on the walls above. What remains most haunting about these ceremonies is not their cruelty, but their intent. Erasmus and his kin believed utterly in their doctrine that through blood and memory, they could transcend mortality, preserving the Whitlock line against decay. To them, every patient lost was not a life extinguished, but a life absorbed, its essence folded into the family's eternal ledger. In this twisted logic, mercy was weakness, and suffering was currency. The town of Providence lived in uneasy proximity to these practices. Some dismissed the stories as superstition. Others avoided the asylum grounds entirely, crossing themselves when its red brick towers loomed in the distance. A few dared to investigate, only to vanish, and all the while, the Whitlocks continued, shielded by wealth, secrecy, and an unwavering conviction that their blood was destined to endure. The rituals of this era marked the asylum's darkest descent, transforming it into something more than a hospital or even a prison. It became a sanctum of obsession, a stage where science and sorcery entwined, and where the Whitlocks rehearsed the same performance night after night, the draining of memory, the harvest of essence, the consecration of their bloodline. And though the world outside would one day forget the details, the walls remembered. Even now, the tunnels beneath the ruins bear silent witness to those ceremonies, their stones etched with soot, their silence heavy with echoes that no passing of years can erase. The collapse of the First World War had left Providence reeling, yet within the walls of the Whitlock Asylum, the war years were remembered for another reason. They brought the institution its greatest harvest of patience. Veterans scarred by shell shock, women widowed and destitute, orphans with no guardians to claim them all, found their way into the asylum's registers. To the public, it seemed the Whitlocks had once again extended their charitable hand to the most vulnerable. But in the corridors of the underground chambers, these arrivals became fuel for experiments that had grown ever more ambitious. And it was during this period that whispers of mass graves first reached the ears of townsfolk. The earliest discovery came by accident. In 1920, a farmer repairing his fence along the asylum's eastern boundary stumbled into a patch of earth that gave way beneath his shovel. To his horror, bones protruded from the soil, dozens of them, tangled together. He reported the finding to local authorities, but by the time an investigation was dispatched, the pit had been filled, the fence repaired, and the Whitlocks denied any knowledge of it. "Old burial ground," Erasmus declared, "left from earlier epidemics." The explanation was accepted, but the farmer, terrified by what he had seen, sold his land and fled Providence within the year. Soon after, similar discoveries began to surface. Hunters in the nearby woods claimed to find shallow graves, their contents half exposed by rain. Children playing near the asylum spoke of stumbling upon skulls, small and delicate, like those of infants. When questioned, the family dismissed these reports as fabrications, but rumors thickened. The asylum cemetery, meant to be orderly, grew erratic. Stones shifted, initials mismatched, earth freshly turned, though no records of burials were kept. Parish priests muttered darkly of mass consignments, suggesting that the Whitlocks were disposing of bodies without rites, denying the dead even the dignity of names. A state inspector named William Horner pressed the matter further. Unlike others before him, Horner refused bribes and demanded access to every ledger, every chamber. In his notes, later recovered in a locked trunk, he described strange inconsistencies, patient registers that listed discharges without destinations, burial records with numbers that did not match the marked plots, and cellars that reeked of charred flesh. "There is evidence of incineration," he wrote. Ashes mingled with bone fragments, hidden behind walls plastered to conceal furnaces. This is not neglect. This is deliberate. Horner disappeared weeks later, his body never found. His report vanished along with him, though copies of his notes, smuggled by a sympathetic clerk, survived to haunt later investigators. For those who remained within the asylum, the truth of the graves was impossible to deny. One attendant, dismissed in 1922, later confessed to carrying corpses through the tunnels at night. They told us these were failed patients, he said, but they were not sick folk who had wasted away. They were strong men, women in their prime, even children. Their bodies bore burns, scars, cuts in strange patterns. They had been used. When pressed, he explained that after the rituals, many patients did not survive, and their bodies were disposed of quickly, unmarked and unremembered. It was not only the graves that unsettled Providence, it was the silence that surrounded them. Families who inquired too persistently were met with curt letters announcing sudden death and urging them not to travel for burial. As the body had already been interred, those who protested further found themselves ostracized, their businesses boycotted, their reputations smeared by rumors that seemed to appear from nowhere. In one case, a mother who accused the Whitlocks publicly was later committed herself, declared unstable and confined within the very asylum she had condemned. By the mid-1920s, the legend of the mass graves had grown. Townspeople swore the earth around the asylum was cursed, that no crops would grow on its borders. Hunters avoided certain clearings where the soil was said to breathe, shifting as though unsettled from below. Children told stories of skeletal hands clawing from the ground, of voices whispering through the mist. Some swore that on moonless nights, the graves glowed faintly blue, as though the rituals below had seeped upward through the soil. The Whitlocks, predictably, denied everything. They held their winter balls, donated to churches, and posed for photographs with mayors and governors. Yet even their allies began to keep a cautious distance. Something in their appearance unsettled, polite society. Skin too pale, eyes too distant, movements too measured. They seemed embalmed, one guest later remarked, as though life clung to them unwillingly. The family's isolation deepened, their public appearances fewer, while the asylum thrived behind its gates. In time, the graves became part of the town's unspoken landscape. Few dared to approach them, fewer still to speak of them aloud. Yet their presence weighed on Providence like a stone on the chest. Every missing child, every vanished veteran, every unanswered letter fed the suspicion that the asylum grounds were honeycombed with the dead. For the Whitlocks, the graves were not merely disposal, but doctrine. Erasmus's surviving journals speak of the garden beneath, where each vessel planted enriches the soil of our bloodline. The metaphor was grotesquely literal. The dead were offerings, their remains both sustenance and shield, binding the family to their legacy. The blood returns to the earth, Erasmus wrote, and from the earth it rises again within us. Thus, the graves were not accidents of cruelty, but the cornerstone of the Whitlock creed. And though their existence was whispered in taverns, feared by farmers, and denied by courts, they remained as undeniable as the soil itself. To walk the asylum grounds was to walk above a multitude of silenced voices, each one buried in darkness, each one feeding the roots of America's most sinister bloodline. What the world could not yet see was that the graves were not the end of the story. They were only the foundation of vast, unseen congregation beneath the asylum, waiting for their silence to be broken, their memory to resurface, and their unfinished tale to stain the earth for generations to come. The 1920s were an age of bright lights and roaring progress for much of America. But behind the iron gates of the Whitlock Asylum, the decade unfolded in shadows. While the rest of Providence embraced jazz, electricity, and motor cars, the institution remained a world apart, bound not by modernity but by the family's deepening entanglement of ritual and science. It was in these years that the line between treatment and sacrament vanished entirely. The asylum ceased to masquerade as a hospital and became something more sinister, a cathedral where human suffering was the liturgy and the Whitlock bloodline its clergy. Survivors' accounts, recorded years later, describe rituals more elaborate than ever before. Patients were no longer gathered only in small circles beneath the asylum, but in vast underground chambers where dozens sat, linked by copper crowns. Witnesses claimed the chambers resembled amphitheaters, their stone walls etched with spirals and sigils that shimmered when touched by torchlight. At the center stood the collector's throne, its wires radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. Erasmus Whitlock presided from this chair, his pale features illuminated by the crackle of blue sparks as his kin chanted in cadence. The ceremonies followed a chilling progression. Patients were first stripped of their names, called instead by numbers or symbols chalked on their wrists. Then came the binding, where their heads were fitted with crowns wired into the central device. Erasmus would intone prayers in Latin, though fragments of his journals suggest these were invocations drawn from older, darker texts. Finally, the current surged, filling the chamber with light and screams. Some patients collapsed lifeless, others sat dazed, their memories erased as though scraped clean. "What we take," Erasmus wrote in 1923. "We preserve. What remains is emptiness. The blood remembers even when the vessel forgets." The jars of silvery liquid multiplied in these years. Hidden cabinets in the asylum's lower vaults were said to contain rows upon rows of glass vessels, each labeled with initials and dates. According to fragments recovered decades later, these jars held the essence of patience, distilled memory and life force, extracted during the rituals. Some were consumed by Whitlock heirs in what they called communion, while others were stored for study, as if each jar were a book in a grotesque library of stolen lives. Yet the rituals did not end below ground. On the surface, the asylum's daily life bore their imprint. Patients in ordinary wards were subjected to smaller experiments, their blood mixed with that of Whitlock's in vials kept in locked cabinets. They were made to recite genealogies aloud, their voices trembling as attendants corrected them, until they spoke as if they themselves were Whitlocks. Some were forced to wear copper circlets for hours, their hair burned away where the metal touched. A few emerged babbling in voices that seemed not their own, speaking of events long past as if remembered firsthand. "I was there at the founding of Providence." One patient declared in 1925, though she had been born in Ohio nearly 2 centuries later, townspeople noticed changes in the family itself. At the rare social events they attended, the Whitlocks seemed transformed, gaunt, waxen, their movements unnervingly deliberate. Their eyes, pale and distant, seemed to regard others with something colder than contempt, as though looking not at people but at vessels waiting to be drained. Guests reported that their conversations grew fragmented. Erasmus would lapse into muttering Latin, while his nieces and nephews spoke of ancestors as if they were still alive, describing their memories in startling detail. "They did not seem like a family," one observer noted. "They seemed like a congregation possessed by the same voice." Meanwhile, the rumors of mass graves deepened. Workers hired to maintain the grounds found patches of earth that shifted underfoot, bones rising through the soil after heavy rains. Some refused to return, swearing they heard whispers beneath the ground when they dug too deep. Families continued to demand answers for missing kin, only to be silenced by threats or by sudden declarations of madness. A few grieving parents who pressed too far vanished entirely, their houses left shuttered, their names erased from parish rolls. Providence grew quieter, cowed by fear, while the asylum loomed ever larger in its silence. Yet for all their secrecy, the Whitlocks could not keep the world at bay forever. In 1927, a journalist named Henry Corbin began investigating the asylum. He collected testimonies from dismissed staff, uncovered inconsistencies in death records, and even claimed to have entered the tunnels himself. His last published article spoke of a machine that devours memory and returns it in the hands of its masters. Days later, Corbin disappeared. His notebook was never found, but townsfolk whispered that his bones joined the multitude beneath the East Wing. By the decade's end, the asylum was a place no one entered willingly. Even suppliers left their deliveries at the gates, refusing to step inside. The grounds grew overgrown, windows dark, save for the faint blue flickers at night. The Whitlocks no longer sought to defend themselves in public. They had no need. Their wealth shielded them, and their doctrine consumed them. Within their walls, the rituals continued, fueled by the steady arrival of new patients and the silence of a town too frightened to resist. The 1920s should have been an age of liberation, of modern medicine replacing superstition, of light overcoming shadow. But in the Whitlock Asylum, the shadows only deepened. Science was not a cure but a mask for sacrifice, and progress was measured not in healing but in jars of stolen essence. What the Whitlocks believed they were building was a dynasty untouchable by death. What they were truly building was a vault of horror, where the cost of their obsession was measured in the silence of the vanished and the weight of the graves beneath their feet. And though the world outside forgot, Providence did not. In taverns and church pews, in whispers passed from parent to child, the story hardened into legend that beneath the Whitlock Asylum lay America's forgotten bloodline, preserved not by mercy or faith, but by ritual, cruelty, and the endless harvest of the living. The Great Depression struck Providence with cruel force, leaving factories shuttered and families destitute. Bread lines stretched along the cobblestones, and the city's most vulnerable sought relief wherever it could be found. For many, that relief came in the form of the Whitlock Asylum. Its gates, already feared for decades, now appeared to some as salvation, a place that promised food, shelter, and care for the troubled or impoverished. The Whitlocks understood this desperation, and they exploited it ruthlessly. With poverty swelling their admissions, the asylum entered one of its busiest and darkest eras. From the outside, the family seized the opportunity to burnish their reputation. Newspapers ran glowing stories about the Whitlocks' generosity, describing the asylum as a refuge for the poor. Photographs showed lines of hollow-eyed men and women entering its gates, escorted by smiling attendants. No one is turned away. Erasmus Whitlock was quoted as saying in 1932, though by then his appearance had grown so cadaverous that some readers found the image unsettling. Yet within the walls, the influx of the desperate only multiplied the Whitlocks' supply of vessels. To them, each hungry soul was not a patient to be healed but an offering to be harvested. Survivors of this period spoke of overcrowding in the upper wards, cots crammed into hallways, patients stacked two to a bed. Conditions were deliberately kept miserable, for suffering was seen as purification. Attendants recalled being ordered to withhold food or to administer bitter tonics that left patients delirious. Those who protested were told this was necessary preparation. Then, when the wards were overfull, groups of patients were led below and never returned. Their absence was explained as sudden death by illness, their bodies supposedly buried in the asylum cemetery. Yet the cemetery showed no increase in graves, and townsfolk whispered that the true burials were hidden beneath the earth. The rituals of the 1930s grew more theatrical. Accounts from dismissed staff describe ceremonies in which entire circles of patients were bound to copper crowns, their wires converging at multiple thrones rather than one. Erasmus presided no longer alone but with his brothers and children, each occupying a throne of their own, as if the bloodline itself were branching outward. The essence flows better through kinship, he wrote in a surviving fragment of his journals. With each vessel offered, The line is fortified not singly but in chorus. Witnesses swore that the results were no longer confined to the patients. Whitlock heirs who participated in the ceremonies seemed to change. Some emerged speaking in voices layered with tones that did not belong to them. Others displayed uncanny knowledge of events centuries past, reciting the names of ancestors long dead. One attendant claimed a young Whitlock daughter addressed him by his grandfather's name, describing details of a farmstead she could not have known. They carried the weight of too many memories, he later said, as though their own selves were drowned beneath a tide of voices. Meanwhile, Providence itself felt the asylum's shadow. Reports of missing persons increased, particularly among the poor. Orphanages quietly emptied their wards into the asylum's care, never questioning why none of the children were seen again. Families too ashamed to admit their struggles sometimes abandoned kin at the gates, believing the Whitlocks would provide better than starvation. Few realized that in offering their relatives to the asylum, they had consigned them to something far worse than hunger. Religious leaders, once beneficiaries of Whitlock donations, began to distance themselves. A few priests dared to denounce the family from the pulpit, warning of sacrilege disguised as charity. One, Father Thomas Kelly, declared that the asylum was a place where the dead walk in silence, where the blood of innocents is traded for power. Days later, he vanished on his way home from evening mass. His parish was told he had been reassigned, but parishioners swore they saw Whitlock men near the church that night, their carriage wheels grinding against the cobblestones. The depression also deepened the asylum's mythology among ordinary townsfolk. Children were warned never to wander near its gates, lest they be taken inside. Farmers refused to work, land abutting the property, claiming crops withered where shadows of the asylum towers fell. And in the winter months, when hunger gnawed most sharply, Providence residents whispered that they could hear the asylum bell, tolling not 12 but 13 strokes at midnight, each peal echoing like a funeral knell across the frozen city. By 1935, the Whitlocks had achieved near total control over their asylum kingdom. The state, overwhelmed by the economic crisis, lacked the resources to investigate. Politicians leaned heavily on Whitlock funding to keep their campaigns alive. And the people of Providence, exhausted by poverty, were too fearful to resist. The family stood unchallenged, their bloodline rituals entrenched as nightly routine, their jars of essence multiplying in hidden vaults. Yet cracks were beginning to show. Erasmus, by then nearly 80, had become a spectral figure. His skin waxen, his hair thin, his body frail, but his mind burned with an obsession that seemed to consume him. His writings from this time grow erratic, filled with phrases that read less like science and more like invocation. The garden grows, the vessels rise. The line endures beyond death. Even his kin whispered of his decline. Some claimed he wandered the tunnels at night, muttering to unseen companions, his lantern casting shadows that moved without him. And still, the rituals continued. On stormy nights, when thunder rolled across Providence, townsfolk swore they heard screams carried on the wind from the asylum hill. Others claimed to see blue light flickering beneath the earth, seeping through the cracks in the stone walls. "The family is feeding," they whispered, shivering as they latched their shutters. The Great Depression left scars across the nation, but none so strange, so hidden, as those it etched beneath the Whitlock Asylum. For in those lean years, when hunger and despair drove thousands to its gates, the dynasty was given its richest harvest. Every vanished soul, every silenced child, every forgotten wanderer became another layer in the soil of its bloodline. And while Providence struggled to survive, The Whitlocks thrived, feeding not on bread or coin, but on lives sustaining a legacy that grew darker with every passing year. By the 1940s, the Whitlock Asylum stood like a relic of another age, its red brick towers looming over Providence as war once again raged across the world. Officially, the institution thrived. Government contracts brought in veterans suffering from battle fatigue, and state subsidies filled the coffers of an already wealthy family. Yet beneath the thin veneer of civic duty, the asylum's inner life had curdled into something entirely removed from medicine. What the Whitlocks practiced by then was not healing, not even the grotesque eugenics of earlier decades, but something closer to religion, a bloodline faith, performed in secret chambers, paid for with the lives of those entrusted to their care. The influx of war patients provided perfect cover. Trainloads of broken men returned from Europe and the Pacific, their minds shattered by bombardment, their bodies scarred beyond repair. Many families, overwhelmed, signed them into the asylum with relief. They will be cared for here, Erasmus's grandson, Victor Whitlock, told the newspapers in 1943, his face pale and unlined as if untouched by age. But those who disappeared into the lower wards were rarely seen again. Families who inquired too persistently received typed letters declaring their kin had died quietly in the night, their remains already interred. Yet the asylum graveyard showed little change. The earth did not rise with new burials. It was whispered, instead, that the tunnels had been expanded once more, the graves hidden deeper than ever before. The rituals of this decade bore a strange intensity, as though the war itself had sharpened the family's hunger. Surviving fragments of journals suggest that the Whitlocks believed global conflict fed their work, that death on such a scale thinned the veil between the living and the beyond. "The harvest of nations enriches the harvest of the line," Victor wrote in 1944. "As blood soaks the earth abroad, the essence flows more readily here. The vessels yield with less resistance." Staff dismissed for disobedience later claimed that entire wards were emptied in a single night, their beds stripped bare by dawn. They took 50 men below, one attendant confessed. Not one came back. The next morning, the family looked refreshed. Townspeople, too, noticed changes. Those few who glimpsed the Whitlocks in public remarked on their unnatural composure. Even as the war dragged on, their faces showed no fatigue, their bodies no frailty. Photographs from the era show men and women who seem strangely ageless, their features waxen, their gazes cold. One neighbor wrote in her diary, "They smile as though smiling is a memory, not a feeling. Their eyes are like glass jars, clear, but empty of warmth." Rumors spread that the family had perfected their rites. Attendants spoke of jars filled not only with the silver essence of patience, but with darker fluids, blood drawn directly from Whitlock kin and mingled in rituals of exchange. Some swore the family consumed these mixtures in ceremonies called communions, believing they absorbed not only memories but vitality itself. The bloodline feeds upon itself. Victor's sister Isolde allegedly told a nurse before dismissing her, and through that feeding, it cannot die. They would have won. The asylum's reputation in Providence sank lower than ever. Children whispered of hearing screams on stormy nights, carried down from the hilltop like the wind's lament. Farmers refused to work land near its borders, swearing the soil grew barren, the animals restless. Priests spoke cautiously, warning parishioners not to tread too close. Yet still, the family remained untouchable. Their wealth shielded them. Their contracts tied them to the state, and their influence silenced opposition. But in the shadows, dissent stirred. A small circle of dismissed attendants began collecting testimonies, smuggling scraps of journals, even sketching maps of the tunnels. They hoped to prove what Providence had long suspected, that beneath the asylum lay a charnel house of sacrifice. One of them, a man named Daniel Harker, wrote a desperate letter to the governor in 1946. The Whitlocks are not physicians. They are keepers of graves. I have seen the jars with my own eyes. I beg you, send men, tear down their walls, expose what lies beneath. The letter vanished into archives, unanswered. Harker himself was found drowned in a quarry weeks later, his body weighted with stones. By decade's end, the asylum had swallowed thousands more. Veterans, orphans, the destitute all fed the insatiable doctrine of inheritance. The Whitlocks withdrew further into seclusion, their estate dark to outsiders, their appearances at civic functions reduced to rare, unsettling glimpses. Yet their legend grew. In taverns and kitchens, Providence residents repeated the same refrain, that the family was no longer entirely human, that their bloodline had been so steeped in stolen essence it had become something other. They do not age, one townsman said flatly. They endure because they live on what they take from others. The world moved on, war ended, prosperity returned, and America turned toward modernity. But the asylum remained unchanged, a relic of cruelty, its gates locked to all but the desperate. And still, the stories endured, of jars glowing faintly in the dark, of chanting that rose from beneath the earth, of an eternal family feeding on silence. By the close of the 1940s, one truth had hardened in Providence. It was a vault, a place where generations had been buried, not in earth but in ritual, their lives distilled and consumed for the sake of a dynasty. The family had succeeded in preserving themselves, but at a cost that defied comprehension. For every Whitlock who endured, dozens lay forgotten beneath, their names erased, their memories bottled, their bloodlines sacrificed to sustain another. And so the legend of America's forgotten bloodline entered its most chilling form. It was no longer just whispers of cruelty or negligence, but the certainty that beneath the asylum, the soil itself was heavy with the weight of centuries of sacrifice. To walk near its gates was to feel the ground pulse faintly underfoot, as though it carried the heartbeat of the thousands who had vanished there. What the townspeople could not decide, what they still cannot decide, was whether the Whitlocks had achieved what they sought. Did their rituals truly graft memory and blood into eternity, or had they instead condemned themselves to something worse than death? A family bound forever to the echoes of the damned, their legacy preserved only by the silence of the graves beneath their feet.